Well, hello, dear listeners, and welcome to another episode of the Reforming Nerdom podcast. I am one of your hosts, Jordan Cecile, and right now I'm joined, as always, by P. Nate, aka Pastor Nate, aka Nathaniel P. Wright. Nathan, how are you?
I'm doing great. Yeah, we're missing one of our three amigos here, but I'm doing well, and I'm looking forward to our later conversation. So it should be a good day.
Yeah, and just so people know, we will be joined by Ben, and as well with a special guest to discuss Star Trek, Mr. Joe Boot, Dr. Joe Boot, and they will be joining us in a little bit. We'll cut to that shortly. But before we do that, just want to remind everybody that we are Reforming Nerdom, and each and every week we get together to talk about all things nerd culture from an unapologetically Christian worldview. If you like listening to us, you can check us out on YouTube. You can listen on podcast services around the world, or join us over at our what is becoming a very active Patreon and Discord community. So if you're interested, you can join us over there as well. Now, Nate, actually, before we even get into some of the things in the news, I was actually wanting to discuss with you something that made me really happy, and that is you have started reading the Stormlight Archive.
Bro, not only have I started, I'm like 700 pages deep, which would be enough to read like 2 regular books. But no, I'm definitely enjoying it. Actually, Ben just started as well. He's only a couple chapters deep. But obviously, between you and the pressure that Joshua Hames put on us, we're into it now. So we're actually just trying to figure out how we can make that into some content. We don't want to do spoilers for anybody who hasn't listened, but maybe doing some sort of recaps on the chapters as Ben and I are getting to them. Yeah, no, I'm loving it. The characters are fantastic. The world building is fantastic. My biggest thing for not reading it wasn't that I didn't think it'd be good. It was that, I mean, when you're looking at 1,500 pages per book, essentially, I'm like, this is a massive time commitment. And I didn't think that the payoff would be worth the time commitment. And I'm here to tell you it totally is.
So when we had Josh on, we were discussing, where he had mentioned his rule for reading a classic, reading a book, and he would cheat and read the whole series. Are you going to cheat and crush the whole series, or what are you thinking? How are you going to handle it?
Yeah, probably. I mean, I'm still reading, I still read theological books. I'm reading Augustine's Confessions as well. So normally I have a theological book and a fictional book that I'm working through, or a theology book and kind of one of my favorites, something like Notes from the Tilt-A-Whirl, that I'll reread. But I will admit that my fiction reading versus my theological reading is looking a little bit like this right now, a little disproportionate. So I'm definitely enjoying it. So I'll be moving on to book 2 as soon as I'm done this one.
Yeah, I mean, I've read a lot of fiction in the last year. I was kind of the same boat where I don't know if I read a fiction book for probably 2 or 3 years, just because it was all theology. And so I'm just feeling right now just like catching up on a lot of the fiction. And I mean, Stormlight is the pinnacle of all that I have read over the last year and a half. There's a few others that I'd like to, once you're done, so in about a year and a half from now, I'll tell you some other ones that are good. But yeah,
Bridge 4 for life, maybe.
Bridge 4. And if you know, you know. If you don't, you got to start reading it. But Bridge 4 is just, it's, you know, and it is spectacular. So I'm excited that you guys are doing it. I just knew that as you guys, you and Ben, who just love fantasy and stories and good writing and good characters, like, yeah, it wasn't a question of whether you would like it. It was just like, I needed to convince you that it was worth the time to do it.
Yeah.
So
Totally.
yeah. So anyways, that's exciting. So fans, you will hear of us talking more about the Stormlight Archive in the coming weeks, as we will likely do some content specifically around it. So yeah, looking forward to that. Now, before we jump over to our the topic of the show with Joe and Ben, I just wanted to talk about a couple things that were in the news. And one of them was the new trailer for Spider-Man, Superman just dropped. And And so, Nate, did you have a chance to watch it?
I sure did. Sure did. I so here's the thing. I liked the feel. I loved how it started, and then the dog showed up.
Okay, so you weren't a fan of crypto.
No, I'm not a fan of crypto. So I mean, it just made it feel cheesy to me. It made it feel a little bit cheaper. Now maybe it'll be. So then when I saw that, I thought, okay, like maybe this is more of a family friendly, like a kids kind of show, like the original trilogy with what's his face when they first came out with the Superman movies, Michael Reeves,
Reeves, Christopher
um,
Reeves.
Christopher Reeves, that's it. When they came out with those original ones, they're kind of family movies, right? They had their cheesy moments and they were kind of family movies. So I thought maybe that was it, but it definitely looked dark. It looked like there's some dark parts with Luther. So it's just like, what are you trying to do here? Because the inclusion of crypto makes it seem a bit more childish, which I'm in for if they go all in for. But I hate it when they don't have direction. So it's like it's kind of a family movie with the inclusion of crypto, and maybe anyway, that was my overall feel. It also just seemed like, part of me, actually, I went back and double checked. I'm like, is this a movie or is this a series that they're advertising for? Because the sheer number of villains and heroes, and like it shows Hawkman, and I think it was actually Hawkwoman. And it just seems like there's going to be a lot packed into it. And this is always DC's problem. They can't just patiently build things. They have to relaunch Superman and add crypto and add Hawkwoman, and they have to have Luther, and they have to have the kryptonite ring that's firing green lasers at things. It just seems like they're trying to do too much.
Yeah, and the thing about this one, like, I understand what they're doing, in that, like, this is a reboot, right? They're starting fresh. They're wanting to, start this whole new DC universe. The challenge that I have with it is I thought Henry Cavill was a perfect Superman.
Agreed. Yeah, agreed.
It's not like they needed. It's not like the previous ones that were made were dumpster fires and it was poorly made. I mean, the cinematography. Like, I just watched some of the trailers that had come out for Man of Steel. Man, it was incredible. Just
Totally.
Like seeing like his flying, the fighting. Again, I thought Henry Cavill was just like perfect, because he also, I think one of the problems I have with this guy is he's nowhere near fit enough in my mind to be Superman. And like that to me, because again, like Superman, now maybe that's just my ignorance of the comics, or like pure lore or something, but the guy just didn't have that kind of menacing Superman presence to him, which
I agree.
Henry Cavill put on
Yeah.
like 60 pounds of muscle to just become an actual like tank. And so I feel for him a little bit in that, where it's just like, I know he was actually really disappointed that he wasn't brought back like Henry Cavill. And
he
so
should have been.
I was
He
just
was a
like,
great Superman.
he was, but I in their desire for this to be an entirely fresh reboot, I get it, because then it would be weird to have him in there with all these other characters in, like, it wouldn't have made sense. So I get it. But it is just a shame, because I thought he was just awesome. I loved Man of Steel. The crypto angle, it's like, I'm curious to see if that's going to be super corny or not.
I just don't see how it can't be. And maybe I'm skeptical.
Yeah.
Like maybe they'll prove me wrong. But don't you think like one of the things that Marvel did so well is like there was the Iron Man movie, and it was about Tony Stark, and it didn't try to pull in too many things. And there was a Captain America movie, and they patiently built the universe and started linking things together. Whereas in this one, it just seems like they're starting with too much too fast. Like
And
they can't play catch up. You got to start. Sorry?
Yeah, it's what they did with the Justice League. Thank you.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden it's like, wait, who is this guy? Like, they're acting as if we've just watched 5 movies with him, and it's like, no, you can't do that. Like, you do have to kind of slow drip it to introduce people. So I think that is going to be interesting, because this seems like a pretty established world that the movie is portraying, with all these villains and other heroes, and they're just kind of there. Like, there's no discovering powers. Like, this is like a which is an interesting take, I guess, where it's like there's no origin story here. Like we're living in a superhero, supervillain filled world already that's existing, and so that's interesting. I'm curious to see how they do that. I mean, James Gunn, I trust him enough that I will give him the benefit of the doubt. Because like when I watched the trailer, I wasn't blown away by it, even though there were aspects of it that I thought were cool. But I do trust him. Like I thought his Guardians of the Galaxy movies were some of the highlights, and I think what he did really well, which he could do here as well, is he made completely irrelevant characters somehow lovable.
Yeah.
Because like Guardians of the Galaxy was just never really a big arc in Marvel. Like it maybe a subgenre of people or like a subculture of people really liked it, but it wasn't ever nowhere near the Spider-Mans or the Superman or the Iron Mans even, or Thors or anything like that. So I'm curious what he does, because like some of those villains, I went and read through somebody had like an Easter egg thread on X or Twitter, and they were pointing out all these characters. It's like, man, these are deep cut characters that are in there.
And maybe, I mean, that is a good point. Like Guardians of the Galaxy did this. It threw you into an established world without much of an origin, without much introduction. And he did it in a way that you were kind of thrown into the world and kind of got your bearings as you were in it. And he actually did that very well with Guardians of the Galaxy. And so you're right. He has earned our trust in that. It just seemed to me like, remember, the Guardians of the Galaxy didn't come out before, Iron Man 1 and Captain America and Thor movies, right? They were, so you're kind of in for it when they're talking about the Marvel Universe. This is sort of the reboot in a lot of ways outside of, and are they going to link this to like the new Batman? Like, is that the hope? Is that who's in this world? Is there anybody, are there any current DC movies that are going to be incorporated into this like DC universe reboot?
As of right now, I think there's a animated show out right now, and I'm drawing a blank on what it's called. Something Commando, Creature Commando.
Okay.
I think is maybe what it is, but that was treated as the first, I think, official drop in this new DC universe, and then this. So as far as I know, I don't think it's necessarily connected. I mean, that new Batman movie has a totally different vibe and aesthetic to it. So I think I'd be surprised if it was, but I think that's where DC, they're in a little bit of a weird spot right now, because even they have some good movies that have come out. I mean, the first Joker movie was interesting and well done. The second, that Folie à Deux or whatever musical nonsense, that I didn't even watch it and don't care to. But like that's a separate Joker from the Joker that is in the Batman, which was played by I forget his name. That I think he was like an Irish guy. But yeah, it's interesting that they're still committed to all these franchises, but not unifying it. So I wonder how much, if that's going to come back to bite them when they're doing that.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. So, I mean, the aesthetic of the actual trailer itself, the music, they did a good job with it. It was well produced. So it just, it was the crypto, it was the hodgepodge of characters that they smashed in there all at once that it just made me a little skeptical. But we'll see.
Yeah. What did you think of the new Lex Luthor?
It looks great.
Yeah.
Yeah, it looks great.
The fact that they had Jesse Eisenberg, is that what his name is?
Yep.
Like that just made no sense at all.
I do agree with that, though. He did a great job. I actually I'm one of his apologists, because I think he did such a great job in Batman versus Superman. But just because he's a great actor, but I do like the aesthetic now. It's more reminiscent of Smallville, which I'm here for.
Yeah, the actor who did Lex Luthor in Smallville, still my favorite portrayal.
He was awesome. Yeah, Smallville was still like low key amazing.
I saw somebody very quickly, and this is a reason I love the internet. They edited this trailer, but with the Smallville music, and to make it look like a Smallville intro. Yeah. Man, that just brought back the feels. I mean, I've started watching through Smallville again, so it's one of my favorite shows ever. So. Yep. We'll see. I think it. I have high hopes. I'll definitely go watch it. It sounds like, in listening to in what James Gunn is saying, that he's really, I don't know where he's on the woke scale, but it sounds like he's trying to make this like a movie that everybody's going to enjoy. So I don't think it's going to be trying to sneak in any identity politics, wokeism stuff. Like he said, it's about hope. It's about like a lot of the values of like the American life. So it sounds like it's probably going to be good, I'm guessing. So we'll see. He wrote it. Like he was the writer of it, and so I've high hopes for that. So stay tuned, and we will. I mean, it's not coming out until July, but we will have more thoughts on it, and I'm sure we'll do a watch and a review of it specifically because it's a big release. It's one that's worth talking about.
Yeah,
and then so lastly here in the news, this was something that I was really encouraged to hear this, and a lot of people were really excited because this is an article from the Hollywood Reporter, and the title of the article is Disney Pulls Transgender Storyline from Pixar's Win or Lose streaming series. And in the article, it says the series follows a co-ed middle school softball team named the Pickles in the week leading up to their championship game. Each of the 8 episodes center on the off-the-field life of a character and their point of view, whether it would be a player, a parent, a coach, or an umpire. A spokesperson for Disney confirmed that the story arc was removed about this transgender student and provided the following statement to the Hollywood Reporter, quote, "When it comes to animated content for a younger audience, we recognize that many parents would prefer to discuss certain subjects with their children on their own terms and timelines." End quote. And the author continues, the character remains in the show, but a few lines of dialogue that reference gender identity are being removed. A source close to to Win or Lose said the studio made the decision to alter course several months ago.
Sure.
Sure. Yeah. I doubt that.
I disagree with that too. I can't imagine that's the case, but
no. And then they go on and says it's not the first time the company has come under scrutiny for LGBTQ plus storylines, particularly regarding its animated content. In 2022, controversy erupted both inside and outside of Disney following former CEO Bob Chapek's much criticized response to Florida's Don't Say Gay bill, which for those who are uninformed, that was simply a bill that restricted teaching kids up to grade 3 about gender and sex. So that was a whole thing. And then in June of that year, Pixar's Lightyear included a same-gender relationship in Kiss, which also sparked controversy. Disney's animation Strange New World featured an openly gay character. Opened several months later, both films, shocker, failed to perform domestically or overseas, earning just $226 million and $73.6 million, respectively. LGBTQ plus content faces challenges in certain international markets where a country may impose a more restrictive age rating or ban the content entirely. And then now I want to end with this because this is, I think, where it's hilarious. The studio is far from alone in grappling with potential fallout from politically charged content. All of Hollywood is bracing for what could be a tumultuous 4 years under the Trump administration. President-elect Donald Trump, who won in a sweeping victory last month, has routinely criticized diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, and it's been widely reported that a number of businesses have started to pull back on DEI programming, a trend that underrepresented groups fear will only continue. Amazing.
Awesome.
And when people say that voting for Trump would not have had any impact, boom.
Yeah. I mean, we've been talking about this a lot since we launched the show. I think that this is just the timing of us launching this is going to give us lots to talk about because I think we're going to see a lot of proof is in the pudding here. But this, I mean, let's not forget that this is a company that several years ago faced a bunch of Christians, cutting the cords to Disney Plus, so to speak, because they openly came out and said that it was their agenda to put gay and trans characters in all the animated shows and everything that they're producing, that they wanted a gay Disney princess and all this kind of stuff. They said that openly. And so for them to now pull back and intentionally make some of their content less gay is a step in the right direction. And it's not because there's been conversion. It's not because there's been, heart changes at Disney. It's because of the changing of the tide. It's much like, up here in Canada, Pierre Poilievre, people forget that during COVID, he was in favor of all the mandated jabs. He was in favor of all of the lockdowns. He was in favor of all this stuff. But as a true politician, he looked at which way the wind was blowing and he supported the convoy. So similarly, here's Disney with their finger out to the wind, seeing which way the wind is blowing, and making decisions because of it. And all we can say is, praise God, that's great.
Yep. Well, and it's interesting for Disney how two movies, like two of their more recent releases. So, I mean, the last year or two has been just terrible for them. Stock price is plummeting, not making money from movies. And like you see that one that I mentioned, which was, what was it called again? Strange World, just tanked, an utter failure. But then you have Pixar's Inside Out 2, which I haven't seen, but apparently they intentionally made it less gay because they had this whole thing in there where they wanted her to be becoming gay. There was a relationship, I guess, in the movie with another girl character where they intentionally redid lighting and redid music and all those things to make it seem far more just like a platonic friendship than a romantic relationship. And that movie, what was it? They released last summer, grossed 1.7 globally as the top grossing animated film of all time, which is interesting. And then also Moana 2, that just came out. That is on its way towards making $1 billion. There's no LGBT stuff. I know there might be some weird spirituality kind of stuff in there that is worth.
Yeah, and a little bit of like
parents.
feminist girl bossy stuff with Moana, but I
mean,
mean,
so it's like stuff that's still worth talking about. But it's just interesting how they intentionally made it less gay, Inside Out 2, and it did well,
and it did better.
They're actively. And so I think we are seeing a shifting of the tide. And I just actually saw yesterday there was a tweet. I think it was an interview. There was an actor. What's his name? I think I have it here. Neil McDonough. Do you know Neil McDonough? He's a Catholic guy. He's an actor. He's one of those guys that has been in so many movies as like or shows as a secondary character. He's just one of those guys that you would see him, you would know him. He's in Minority Report, one of the cops in Minority Report. Yeah. But he was pretty much ousted from Hollywood because he refused to kiss a woman on a movie project or a TV project that he was part of, and he refused to because he's like, no, I kiss my wife. She's the only one who kisses me. So he was booted from Hollywood pretty much and couldn't find work. So he was in one of the Angel Studios movies, and so, but I bring him up because he was doing this interview with someone and saying he now is being contacted by Hollywood execs who are now wanting to add faith-based movies to their lineup in the coming years.
Awesome.
So like we're seeing it, right? We're seeing what happens when the impact of a vote, the impact of cultural engagement, and actually be mindful of those things, how it can manifest itself. So I think we have much to be excited about. Yeah, and I think it's going to be we only have positive things to see moving forward. But well, enough of the news. So why don't we just quickly take a minute to hear from a couple of our sponsors, and then we will jump into our interview with Dr. Joe Boot, and we'll be rejoined by Ben Jamin as well.
Have you ever opened your internet browser in search of quality Christian books, only to find yourself wading through page after page of Joel Osteen books, Nerf guns, and tacky wall art? Thousand Generations Print Company is here to save the day. With a unique, family-owned approach, quick 24-hour processing, a commitment to providing heretic-free literature, and real human customer service, they focus on offering books that not only enlighten but align with Orthodox Christian teachings. And, being conveniently located in Southern Ontario, there's no more need to sell your left kidney to pay for shipping within Canada. Visit at actuallychristianbooks.com. Again, that's actuallychristianbooks.com. And order yourself anything from Haunted Cosmos to Sir Battle-Lot and use promo code NERDOM, that's NERDOM, all caps, and receive 10% off your next order. Thousand Generations Print Company, books for building, books for battling, for 1,000 generations.
I'm Brent, and I'm rebuilding LEGO Star Wars to be the best display and play LEGO models. I enjoy the nostalgia of Star Wars by creating LEGO sets designed for adults but can be handed down to children. I've spent far too much time obsessed with Lego and Star Wars, and God made me far too creative to let it all go to waste. So I created a YouTube channel, Boffman Bricks, to share what I'm building.
Well, welcome back, everybody, and I'm very pleased to be able to now introduce our special guest for this episode of Reforming Nerdom to talk all things Star Trek, Mr. Joseph Boot, Dr. Joseph Boot. Joe, welcome.
Live long and prosper, Jordan. Great to be on.
Oh, beautiful. Excellent. Joe, I think a lot of our listeners probably know who you are, but why don't you just quickly just give a little bit of an introduction of who you are, what you're doing, and just so help out those who might not know who you are.
Yeah, I'm a Christian apologist focused in worldview and cultural apologetics, and I'm the founder and president of the Ezra Institute, and we have offices in Canada, the US, and the UK, and I was in Canada for nearly 20 years. I also founded and pastored Westminster Chapel in Toronto for 14 years. Now I'm back in the UK and traveling backwards and forwards between our offices and working with our Ezra team, two of which are on this call as it happens. So great to be on this new show that you guys are developing.
Joe, we're just trying to apply what you have taught us, and we're just trying to take over nerd culture. That's what this is.
That's right.
Yeah.
Along with your friend on your shoulder there, Captain Jean-Luc Picard.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah. Just in case
Is that the angel or the demon on your shoulder there?
It's just in case I need to consult on any of these questions. I've got him to hand. Yeah, maybe he's probably a mixture of both angel and demon, really. Star Trek. Yeah.
Did you watch, Joe, any of the newer Picard show that came out?
I did. I watched all 3 of the seasons. I think it was 3 seasons.
Oh.
The only season that I really enjoyed was season 3.
See, I watched the first season and it didn't really do much for me, so I never made it to season 3.
Yeah. So season 3 is a kind of is what everybody was really waiting for the show Picard, really. You know, that in my view, the franchise has gone downhill steadily since The Next Generation. And so, you know, bringing the show Picard, you know, was obviously to try and bring the fan base back because he was such a popular figure, such a popular character. The first 2 seasons, the first season especially, was pretty weak, pretty woke. The second season was marginally better. The third season was bringing back all the old characters, and so I enjoyed that because of the sort of Star Trek reunion festival. Really, is what they did with it, and as a result, of course, it was
giant
popular.
Comic-Con.
I mean, that's what people wanted. That's why people originally tuned into Picard. They didn't want some wokeified, you know, Federation and a sort of wet lettuce Picard who no longer knows who he is. And so
you mean like Luke Skywalker in the new Star Wars movies?
Yeah. I mean, we'll come to Star Wars, of course. I've never really been a Star Wars guy, but yes, from what I know, yeah, exactly.
That's all we were waiting for as Star Wars fans, was to get the gang back together.
Yeah.
And then they killed everybody off before they even met each other. Like, just the dumbest decision.
Yeah, that's a shame. So yeah, so the third series was worth watching.
Okay. Well, before we go real deep into Star Trek, Joe, one of the things we like to do with our guests is ask rapid fire questions just to help people get a sense for what kind of nerd are you? Because Nate and I know you a bit, and we know that you have some nerdy tendencies. So real quick, the first one you're going to answer pretty quick because you already said it, but rapid fire, don't think too much about it. Star Wars or Star Trek?
Star Trek.
Lord of the Rings or Narnia?
Lord of the Rings.
Marvel or DC?
Marvel.
Favorite video game console?
Never played any of them.
Okay.
Did your kids play like Nintendo or Sega or anything?
No,
Yeah, what would have been like the favorite one in your house? Like with even
we've
your
never had
kids?
one in the house. We
Never
never
have?
really
Okay.
allowed it because I wanted my son to get good exam results.
Okay.
So
Favorite?
he is one of his friends has a PlayStation that he sometimes comes over with, and sets up on our TV, mainly playing FIFA. But no, we've never had a games console. What we do have in the corner of our family room is basically a sort of a relaunched arcade machine
Oh yeah.
that has
Oh,
some of the games from the 90s on it, so and late 80s, so Street Fighter, early iterations of Street Fighter,
right on.
and a few others that sometimes gets
Nice.
played. But it's in one of those big, a big box with the old-fashioned
Yeah.
screen and the old-fashioned buttons.
Like
They sort
joystick and 2 buttons kind of thing.
of
So
exactly.
would you have been a like go to the arcade kind of kid growing up? Like would you have done that?
No, yeah, my dad was a pastor. I couldn't afford it.
Okay.
We so I mean, very occasionally, if you were had some spare change and you were going past one, you might have a quick go on one of the driving games. Yeah, Sega used to do some driving games, didn't they?
Oh yeah.
So I remember some of those, and then we did have, remember the old sort of cassette players where you had to load up the game, and it took like maybe you guys are too young to remember that, but yeah, it took like 5 or 10 minutes to load a computer game on a ZX Spectrum or something like that, or what they called in the UK the BBC computer. And there were a few basic games that we used to play on that, and I think for a short while we did have one of the early iterations of the PlayStation when I was in my late teens, but yeah,
Okay.
it was never really been a huge thing. In terms of sort of scale of 1 to 10 of how nerdy I am, it's sort of fairly limited to some certain limited areas, let's say.
That's okay.
I don't tick all the boxes.
That's okay. Favorite cartoon growing up?
He-Man.
Okay.
Nice.
Choice. Favorite 80s action hero?
Oh.
It could be the actor or the character. We'll accept either one.
Well, probably a toss-up between Arnold Schwarzenegger and Steven Seagal.
Okay. Yep. Good
Who
choice.
wins in a fight?
Oof. I mean, that's a whole episode we need to do. Like,
Yeah.
who would actually win in a fight? And
Yeah, I
'cause,
mean, there were lots of the action stuff that I really liked. I was a big fan of the A-Team and Knight Rider and all of that growing up. And there were a lot of those action heroes. But I think, I enjoyed the earlier Steven Seagal movies when he didn't weigh 400 pounds. And some of the fight sequences were just exquisite. And fantastic to watch. Obviously Arnold just a bit more, brute strength, brute force, but those two.
one of my favorite quotes from an 80s action movie is Seagal in Time to Kill, where it's the fear of death is worse than death itself, and it's like that's an iconic one. All right, and
You mean it's not Arnold when he says "Get to the chopper"?
no,
That's not your favorite quote.
as we discussed on our Christmas episode, my favorite quote of Arnold is "Put that cookie down." in Jingle All the Way. All right, and your favorite nerdy activity, Joe?
Airfix modeling.
Cool.
Yeah,
Okay,
I
nice.
I'll be doing some over Christmas as well. I like making some of the old models, aircraft and ships and that kind of thing.
Okay.
Very cool.
Well, and you'd appreciate then our sponsor, who we mentioned earlier, or in the show earlier. He rebuilds Lego and like makes Lego sets better, Boffman Bricks. And so when we connected with him, I ended up buying a Millennium Falcon set and then all the extra pieces. So over Christmas, my hope is to, with my kids, build this Millennium Falcon, and I am so excited. Like this is like the most excited I've been at Christmas in a long time because I love Lego, and so yeah, I'm excited to do that. So that's fun. All right, before we get into this topic of the show, which is Star Trek, I thought it'd be good for those who might not know as much about it, because admittedly, Star Trek is not something that I've ever really been hugely into. My dad liked it growing up, but I've always been more of a Star Wars guy. So we're going to give a little bit of a history of Star Trek and then some interesting facts about Star Trek. So Star Trek was started by Gene Roddenberry. He started ruminating the idea in the early 1960s, where he envisioned a fictional television series exploring social issues of the time, and he wanted to do that through a futuristic storytelling. The first show debuted on September 8th, 1966 on NBC. It was starring William Shatner as Captain James T. Kirk, Leonard Nimoy as Spock, and DeForest Kelley as Dr. Leonard Bones McCoy. And it followed the crew of the USS Enterprise as they explored strange new worlds and sought to boldly go where no man has gone before. Do you guys know, though, how many seasons it got in before it was canceled?
Was it 5? Just like 3, wasn't it?
It was 3 seasons, 1969. It had bad reviews or bad ratings, so it wasn't watched a ton. But what saved Star Trek was syndication. So when it was on syndication afterwards, that led to a lot of people watching it. And then that led to a animated series in 1973 and additional movies.
I don't think I've ever seen that.
I haven't either. But yeah, in 1973, and then there also started to be fan conventions in the 70s, which led to then movies from the 70s to the 90s. Star Trek 2, which was The Wrath of Khan, which was one that I had heard of all the way up until Star Trek 6, The Undiscovered Country in 1991. Star Trek has also been really popular on additional other television shows, which aired from 1987 to 2005. The Next Generation with, as already mentioned, Captain Jean-Luc Picard, Deep Space Nine, and then there are also 4 movies set in the the Next Generation series. Yeah. It was rebooted by J.J. Abrams. Don't remember the date of that, but it was set in an alternate universe. And then now there is a new show on Paramount Plus called, I believe, Star Trek Discovery. And Star Trek, it is known for pushing diversity, which was one of the first shows with a multiracial cast at the time when it was less common. It is known for tackling contemporary social issues and also inspiring real-life innovation. So, some extra Star Trek facts. Lucille Ball, do you guys know who that is? I Love Lucy?
Yes.
She saved Star Trek. Apparently, the legendary actress and producer, she was instrumental in getting Star Trek, the original series, on the air. It was her studio that produced the show, and she personally supported it, believing in its potential even when others were skeptical. So we can thank I Love Lucy for saving Star Trek. Actually, interesting, similar to that, the John Wick movies, which I'm sure you guys would know about, it was Ava Longoria, apparently, that self-funded the movie when it was short on cash and was potentially going to get scrapped. She contributed the money to continue the John Wick movies early on.
Really? Interesting.
Yeah.
That's surprising.
Second interesting fact, it was, at least it is, this might be debated, but from what I was able to tell, most people would say that Star Trek was the first interracial kiss broadcast on American television in the episode Plato's Stepchildren in 1968.
Was that between Kirk and Uhura or Kirk and an alien?
Yeah.
What are they?
No, Captain or Lieutenant Uhura.
Yeah, not
Uhura?
interracial like green alien shit.
No. They weren't ready for that yet. Not yet.
No. It was Kirk and the blue alien, right?
Yeah. Another interesting fact, the Klingon language was invented for the movies. The Klingon language spoken by the warrior species was created by linguist Mark Okrand for Star Trek III, The Search for Spock. And today it is a fully developed language with its own grammar, vocabulary, and some fans speak it fluently. Joe, do you speak Klingon? Is that one of your secret talents?
There
you go.
Very limited amount of Klingon.
All right.
Yeah.
So Joe
You
is
can
not
actually
secret.
Like, I'm pretty sure you can even take like college courses.
I was
on
just going
Klingon.
to say, you can
now.
actually take Klingon as a language in certain universities, which is crazy.
And then lastly, the sound of the doors is a toilet flush. The iconic swooshing sound of the Enterprise's sliding doors was created by layering sound effects, including the flushing of a toilet. So
That's
some
good to
interesting
know.
facts. Now, Joe, when we were talking to you about coming on the show, like your immediate suggestion or the thing that you thought you would like to talk about is Star Trek. So what is it about Star Trek that even all these years later, you're still watching the shows, you're still, wanting it to be relevant? Why is it that you like Star Trek?
Well, you've actually probably picked up on one or two of those things already, just in the commentary there. Star Trek, first and foremost, actually seeks to retell the Greek and Roman mythology in a science fiction genre, and then it does so, and then in doing so, it explores really all the critical social and cultural issues. Let me just put Picard down for a moment while I'm seeking to explain myself. So, when you think about the some of the key figures, the Vulcans, the Romulus, the Remans, you can see immediately the influence of Greek and Roman mythology on Star Trek. And so it really is the retelling of many of those classic stories in a sci-fi genre. Along the way, it seeks to ask a lot of the critical questions about human life and existence, the nature of human beings, the nature of man, the nature of the universe, and effectively discusses them, especially with the next generation, in the dramatized sci-fi format. And of course, with sci-fi, what you can, as time has moved on in the West, and it's been increasingly difficult to ask some of those serious questions in mainstream media, sci-fi, punching things into the sci-fi realm, somehow gives producers, directors, writers permission to ask those core questions, because they seem sufficiently removed from the audience to be permissible to ask them and deal with them in a way that a lot of the contemporary television won't touch or doesn't address, or is just pumping out one message at you rather than asking the question. So actually, if you look at statistically at the kind of people that watch Star Trek, and studies and research has been done on this, it's actually doctors, lawyers, politicians, intellectuals tend to watch Star Trek. They're drawn to Star Trek precisely for that reason. It's actually, although it sounds odd to say about sci-fi, it's actually very serious television. It's the thinking man's television. It's predominantly men, by a long stretch, who watch Star Trek, and it tends to be thinkers, so or people in those sorts of professions. So I guess I was drawn to it in part because I'm sort of wired that way, asking those big questions. I'm drawn to more serious television. It's very entertaining, of course, but it asks these big questions, tells these great stories, these big stories about reality, in a genre that provides entertainment, provides a sense of distance from it that the audience can therefore relate to, without getting too offended or upset, if you know what I mean. That's the purpose of being one step removed. Take, for example, very quickly, just one illustration: the characters of Spock and Commander Data. So Spock is the Vulcan in the original series, and his quest is that he is half human, he's half Vulcan, so he doesn't feel fully human, and he's on this quest to be purely logical, purely rational. And that, in some respects, reflected the 19th century and much of scientism and philosophy dominated the academies through the early part of the 20th century. The quest to be purely rational, purely logical. In the original series, human emotions early on, at least in Spock's character, later on in the films, he starts to ask more questions about it, starts to see the limitations of pure logic. But early on, it's very much he's trying to suppress his human side. He's trying to liberate himself from emotion, which he sees as basically distracting and leading to error and poor judgment and so on. To be purely rational, that should be the goal. This is contrasted with the Dr. Bones, who seemed to be very emotional and somewhat irrational. Whereas, and you fast forward into the next generation, you have in the character of Commander Data the embodiment of pure logic, pure rationality. He's an android. He's a machine. He's pure logic. But his quest is to become human and to try and discover what it means to be human. And be the professor of the humanities, if you will, as I think Q calls him in one episode, the semi-godlike figure. And of course, eventually, Commander Data gets this emotion chip and begins to discover emotion, what it means to be able to react emotionally. And there's some very interesting dialogue that happens in one of the later Next Generation episodes between Spock, where Leonard Nimoy is brought back for one of the later episodes, and conversations with Commander Data, where they discuss this very thing, where Data says, "Well, I'm the embodiment of what you've longed to be, and in some respects, you've tried to reject. You've sought to reject that." So those kinds of things about what it means to be human, logic and reason, emotion, the relationship of these different things. These are the questions that are seriously asked and discussed in Star Trek, and I think I was drawn to it for those reasons, really.
I think you're right. I think that if you just want to compare Star Trek, Star Wars, it's the easy comparison. Like, obviously, Star Trek gives you the opportunity. Like, say, even if you're just sitting with your kids watching it or whatever, it's like it's got questions that are worth asking.
Yeah.
The problem with Star Trek is like, especially with later Star Trek, is that the answers that you're given on screen are the answers of the showrunners and the writers and the directors. And so it's like fully dependent on, if you can get a good writer, you get a good director, you get good answers. I mean, sometimes it's still worth watching just to have the question posed, but the answers that you're given are so often terrible.
I really like when you were contrasting sort of Data and Spock, and it's interesting because I do agree with you, Ben, and I think that's why earlier iterations of Star Trek were so much better than later iterations, because we live in a time when most of the writers and Hollywood has been infiltrated by woke Marxist ideology. But I do think that it's a very interesting thought to be able to explore questions. I'd never thought about that, Joe, and sort of when you put it in the distant future. I think it's the 24th century in that Star Trek is set in, and when you put it there, you're able to ask some political questions, and you're kind of able to explore some things that might be a little bit taboo. And there, I'm sure that there are essays written on which alien races represent which countries in terms of their struggle against the U.S. Yeah, for sure. And so I think that's that I'd never really thought about that sort of the distance of time was a tool to allow them to explore social questions that they weren't as free to do in terms of offense and kind of putting their hat in the ring on where they stand on certain issues. So that's a really interesting.
Yeah, well, they explore, for example, euthanasia is explored in Star Trek, homosexuality, androgyny, all of those sorts of questions, the life issues.
Transhumanism is a big one, right?
Transhumanism. I'd love to come to that, and actually the whole idea of the cyborg, which is addressed in the character of the Borg, as well.
So the Borg are like maybe the best television villain ever.
Yeah.
They're just fantastic.
It does a good job when you get to an episode and the Borg show up. There's actually an anxiety that comes into the viewer because they don't beat the Borg. The Borg are unbeatable, right? And so there's this kind of anxiety, like they're going to have to escape because they can't fight these guys.
Yeah, there's certainly in the early encounters with the Borg, that's a very strong feature. Yeah.
Were the Borg in the original show? When were they introduced?
The Borg were
Next
introduced
Generation, I believe.
in the Next Generation.
Okay.
They're first introduced in an episode where Q, the sort of semi-godlike character from the Q continuum, sends the Enterprise into a part of space that they couldn't get to with it. It would take several 100 years to get there, or certainly maybe 70 or 80 years to get there. And so they have this early encounter with the Borg, and their hull gets carved up, and this is to teach them. He's trying to teach them a lesson that they shouldn't get too big for their britches. That's when they first appear in Star Trek, and yeah, it is disturbing. It's disturbing stuff.
Yeah.
They're very interesting as characters. I agree that
like
the writing in the 60s, and then the writing in the 80s and 90s. Obviously, it's reflecting the changing of dominant worldviews. But the questions they posed are interesting, and it is complex because there was an episode, for example, in the original series called Bread and Circuses, where Jesus Christ, Christianity is referred to very favorably. Jesus Christ is even referred to as the Son of God. This is in the original series. In Star Trek: The Next Gen, because of the religious devotion of some of the characters, like Worf, who's a Klingon, and because of the for both Kirk and Patrick Stewart in The Next Generation, Shakespeare is their favorite author, and Shakespeare gets quoted a lot in Star Trek. You have fascinating conversations there about the nature of man and God. And in fact, one of the movies, The Final Frontier, which was the fifth of the Star Trek movies, from the original Star Trek crew, Captain Kirk, is all about the search for God.
Literally.
Literally the search for God. Yeah. And there's some very interesting questions posed in there. The whole idea of, that basically the idea is that the Earth has sent out a satellite that's been gathering knowledge for centuries and is looking for its creator. Sorry, that's the first Star Trek. So in the very first, the motion picture, you have the satellite sent out. It's looking for, it's gathering knowledge, and then it's looking for its creator. And so very early, Star Trek sets up the fact that it's asking these ultimate questions. Then in Star Trek V, they are actually one of Spock's relatives believes he has discovered that beyond this great barrier in space, he's discovered where God is. And the whole thing is about a journey to try and discover, and I won't spoil it if somebody wants to watch the movie. And the questions that are raised in it wasn't actually the most favored movie by fans, I think maybe partly because of the theme. So it's not, the humanistic secular worldview is absolutely present, but it's not cut and dried that this is the worldview of the writers. There's evidently the strong influence of the Christian worldview in some of it.
That's interesting, because that was actually what I was just going to ask you, Joe, is we see in so many things, even if they're not overtly Christian, they can't escape reality, and they can't escape like common grace. They can't escape these themes that we see of good overcoming evil, whether it's like prophecies or just redemption arcs or things like that. So that's what I was going to ask. Like, how is, 'cause I think Star Trek is more overtly secular humanist, would you say, than like Star Wars? Would it be, or it?
Well, Star Wars is deeply influenced by Hinduism.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's more like a pagan spirituality versus a secular humanism like Star Trek.
Yeah, I think it was it what was his name? One of the great Hindu epics. I thought I may have scribbled it down somewhere here, actually. Yeah, Ramayana.
It was right on the tip of my tongue too.
Was was the sort of epic narrative that Joseph Campbell was influenced by. So Star Wars, the Force, that's a very that's a very Hindu concept. Yoda says, fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, hate leads to suffering. That's Hinduism. So
Also just nonsense, but
yeah,
It's Hindu nonsense.
Hindu nonsense. So whereas Star Trek tends to have a sort of utopian humanism, it's got a sort of secularized. I would call it a secularized postmillennialism. Is what Star Trek is positing,
Yeah.
right?
I was gonna, Joe, what do you think of? It always irked me that, right? Because that, like you say, it is this like utopian vision of a future Earth, and in every Star Trek, future Earth in their utopian vision is this like socialist. There's no more currency. Everyone, there's no more nations. It's just the Federation, and I don't know. Like that just always annoyed me about Star Trek.
Yeah, the sort of picture of the Federation is unquestionably utopian. And the whole idea is that this comes out strongly in First Contact, the movie, where it's explicitly discussed that the acquisition of wealth is no longer an objective because war's been eliminated and disease has been eliminated and currency has been eliminated, and so the whole idea of markets and cost, because somebody asks Picard, they're on the Enterprise E, and they say, what did this cost? All of this titanium or whatever I think the alloy is, and he said, well, the economics of the future are different. So you have a character, you have a race in Star Trek that kind of represents the old market system, and they're the Ferengi,
Which are
and
so obviously Jew coded.
yeah,
seriously.
It's funny.
So you've got you've got this the constant sort of idea of bartering and value and money and everything else. So yeah, you see that those themes are present. At the same time, you get this strong sense, especially in the original series, and then to a large extent in the Next Generation, strong sense of right and wrong, of objective standards of justice. Q is always mocking Picard for these great speeches about justice and equity that he gives, there's a famous. It might have been called the Drumhead, actually, which is a fascinating episode about false accusations or judicial bias in the courts, and so Picard is sort of this more of a sort of cosmic diplomat than he is a warrior. Although there's the warrior, those two elements of his character are always in play with one another. The warrior spirit with the diplomat, whereas Picard is very much the pure warrior character. He's always got his shirt off fighting some alien. But again, a very strong sense of justice, of good and evil, of right and wrong, of truth and falsehood. And that starts to really dissipate in the later seasons. Once you get out of the Next Generation, that really starts to die a death in the Star Trek franchise. So,
I
think
grew
one
up,
of the reasons
Joe.
I lost interest.
Yeah, so my like timeline of Star Trek watching, I grew up kind of watching Next Gen reruns. And then the show that actually came out when I was a kid, I don't know, probably 10 or something, that was a brand new, was Voyager, which I've gone back and watched episodes and they're like, man, so they're quite bad. But one, like, as you're bringing it up, just this like sense of morality that exists in the universe that they have no basis for, but still exists, right? You still have Picard giving his speeches and talking about, righteousness and goodness and everything. And even in that show, the whole premise of the show is they get pulled into a whole nother quadrant of the galaxy, and it'll take them hundreds of years to get home by, regular means. And so every time they come up to an opportunity to exploit somebody to get them home, they don't, because of this moral code. Somebody, you'll have one say like we should do it, and the other side saying no, we can't do it because of this this morality that still exists in the Star Trek universe for whatever reason, I don't know.
Yeah, well, that comes out very strongly in especially the encounters with Q from the Q continuum. This sort of almost godlike figure from Greek mythology, who's trying to put the crew of the Enterprise on trial, on the basis of what? And as you get to the end, I think it's of season 7. You do get some resolution to all of that, but the debates and conversations between Q and Picard on this issue of justice and morality, it's always being presupposed that there's this standard of justice. And I have to say that very often, Picard gets it exactly right. I mean, there's an episode where his counselor on the ship, Deanna Troi, is being used by an empath to take all of his negative emotions, and it's aging her rapidly so that within a few days she's literally become an old woman. Picard goes into this incredible moral soliloquy or speech about the immorality of trying to use another human being as a receptacle, so all of those questions are addressed, assuming that the viewer actually shares an objective moral framework. But as you say, they never really justify it. And at the same time, God is, I would call it an agnostic, overtly agnostic worldview, because God is never ruled out of the picture. On one occasion when Picard thinks he's died of a heart attack, he's got an artificial heart, and to discover himself confronted with Q, he says, I refuse to believe you're in control of the afterlife. So there's not a radical skepticism about the idea that human beings are more than the matter in motion, and that's explored when they look at what makes a human being, and what makes personhood. That's explored with Commander Data as well. So you're right that there's a presupposed moral framework. What's interesting is that it's never grounded. So from presuppositional apologetics point of view, you could have an absolute field day with Star Trek, asking, well, what is actually the basis, even of
by what standard, Captain Picard?
Yeah. Well, I think that's one of the reasons. Even when you get into movies like First Contact, and they have to do the time travel thing, because they don't actually show they don't show Earth in its sort of utopian reality, because it's not there. Like, it's interesting that you take the humans out into space, and there are these like moral quandaries. Some of them act badly. There's debate about whether they do this or do that. Like, you can't get away from the depravity of humanity, and guys like Picard, who are these sort of guys of moral excellence, they might ultimately make the right decision, but Earth remains this utopia where nothing bad happens and nobody's doing anything wrong, and they can't show that because it's not a reality. They recognize they have to take the sin of humanity into space in order to keep Earth. So it's just funny how they can't really hold to their own standards. But
when they do look at Earth in the movies, whether that's in First Contact or in The Voyage Home, or in on the holodeck, which they sometimes do in various stories. They must always go back to the past, and it's invariably the 20th century or the beginning of the 21st century.
It's the past, but it's our past.
It's our past.
Right. It's not like their past, but our future. It's our past also.
And they must go back that far, because they never explore, never look at the Earth in their time, lest the illusion of utopia be betrayed. I think that's right. I mean, maybe you could argue that actually in the Picard series, where he is on Earth initially, in the early part of that sort of reboot.
But ironically, like not very utopian.
No, not
Is-
utopian.
right? Like that's the feel I got from that first season. Was like, oh, this kind of
big mess.
is like a
big mess.
dark, dank mess. Yeah.
Yeah. That's the only time I've seen it looked at, and it's not very coherent with the original Star Trek world. So,
yeah, I think one of the things that I found really interesting as I was listening to you talk about Q, I didn't see all of the newer movie reboots. I did see the one that first introduced Christopher Pine.
The first one's the only one.
Yeah, and there was that.
Really.
There was the villain there was trying to sort of control time because he had lost his wife or something like that, or child. I can't remember what it was. But there's this villain that's kind of motivated by very similar things to any kind of movie villain would be. I find
do you mean the Next Generation film you're talking about? Are you talking about?
No,
I was talking about the
J.J.
first one
where
with Christopher Pine,
he's like
where he
Romulan
plays young
guy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But
Whereas
the
like his
reason
wife and daughter died. Yeah.
Yeah, when Romulus was destroyed, right? Like that, and he's trying to go back, or no, I think he's trying to destroy and get vengeance. Anyway, I only bring that up because
he's taking vengeance on Spock.
That's right,
because he didn't save the planet.
Yeah,
and he blames him. Yeah,
but my point in all that is because it's a very one-dimensional character, and I think one of the things that Next Generation in particular had going for it was just the depth of characters. You've talked about Data, and then when you were talking about Q, you know, it's a very interesting thing to sort of have this villain, and you're always asking the question, how much of a villain is Q? Is he really bad? Is he just mischievous? He's sort of the Loki character of the world.
Yeah.
And he seems to enjoy pranks more than overt evil. And so they do these characters, and then even the Borg, who are sort of the quintessential villain, you know, they do that in a really interesting way as well. So, you know, sometimes the Klingon, but there's complexity to the characters and to the nations and to the races that I think, I don't think the newer shows, they were just recapitulating and kind of ruining some of the ethos of the various characters and worlds and things like that. So I do think that Next Generation was sort of the high watermark of Star Trek for that reason. And Q is a really fascinating character to talk about because of his sort of mischievous, is he a villain? Is he a good guy? Mentality. But I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. You alluded to the Borg, but our pastors that I'm training up at our church, we're going through the Mission of God right now, and the last chapter we were on, you actually referenced the Borg when you're talking about transhumanism. And so I'd just be interested to hear you kind of assess the Borg, and just, I guess, because one of the comments that came out by one of the young guys is, man, this was way ahead of its time. We're talking about transhumanism now. This was 10 years ago that Dr. Boot was writing about it. And I mean, in a lot of ways, Star Trek was the first real serious cinema that explored transhumanism. So I'd just be interested to hear you kind of do a bit of a deep dive on that, on the Borg.
Well, they're completely fascinating for a number of reasons. The objective, well, first of all, so for those who don't know, the Borg, you know, obviously is a play on the idea of cyborg. They are an attempt to bring together humanoid features to merging with technology, and what's the goal? The goal explicitly is perfection. They are seeking perfection, and they exist with a kind of collective consciousness. And this, of course, was, you know, the modern transhumanists and the transhumanist writers all talk about this kind of omega point, a place of shining light and glory where man merges with his own technology in a unified consciousness, of which they see the internet as the first stepping stone to an eventual single consciousness. So the Borg are a hive mind. And it's a place, though, where, that interestingly enough, Star Trek is one of the few sci-fi genres that looks at the transhuman idea as utterly dystopian, not utopian.
I was going to say, I find it really interesting that in their search for perfection, they're in every objective way, like disgusting, right? Like they're like just terrible to look at. They're deformed. They're, and so like there's no redeem. That's actually, again, one of the things I hated about Voyager was they introduced a new, like, bigger, badder villain that was even, species 8472 that was killing off the Borg, and they have to ally with the Borg. And I'm like, no, like the Borg are enough. Like we don't need they are the perfect big bad.
They're the perfect enemy. Yeah.
Yeah.
And, their ships, the perfect cube. There's all kinds of images of the pursuit of perfection with the Borg. And it of course mimics, in the biblical and Christian world and life view, there is a unity and a sharing, a participating in the divine nature, but without the destruction of individuality. And what the Star Trek abhors is the notion that the individuality of a person would be destroyed and lost in this collective consciousness. And of course, famously, Patrick Stewart, Jean-Luc Picard, is briefly, he is basically turned into a Borg. He is what they call, its resistance is futile, you'll be assimilated. And so he is assimilated briefly into the Borg collective, and is eventually rescued. And
one of the best story arcs, maybe the best story arc in all of Star Trek. That was
incredible. Yeah.
Awesome.
I mean, it's very interesting to watch, actually, if you watch, from the very first one where they first encounter the Borg right through to the First Contact, Star Trek First Contact, to look at that story arc of the Borg is fascinating. So the cyborg, as a modern humanist dream, as something that's ideal, looked at as ideal by the transhumanists, by those who believe in post-transhumanism, is seen in the Star Trek world as a terrible and a dreadful dystopia, and something that needs to be avoided at all costs because of the destruction of the individual, which is actually very interesting. That Star Trek highlights that particular issue. But it's this pursuit of perfection and the idea that if we merge with our own technology, or if we take over the technology of others, which is what the Borg is doing, they assimilate whole worlds in order to steal their technology in the pursuit of perfection in this hive mind collective consciousness. And the Picard is the character who, as an individual, resists the collective, and then having been briefly assimilated and then escaping, knows how to fight the Borg. And that, of course, is the story of First Contact. He's got this insight into how to destroy the Borg. And then, of course, eventually there are in the next gen, there are Borg that discover their individuality. And that leads to the eventual, decay of certain parts, I guess, because they reappear as was noted, they reappear in Deep Space Nine. But aspects of the Borg that actually start to collapse and fall apart. Their societies, their hive starts to fall apart because some of the units have discovered their individuality. So. And then in First Contact, the question of should you treat a Borg that's hooked into the hive mind, into the collective, with respect as an individual. So this human who's been brought up to the Enterprise is horrified when Picard is on the holodeck using a machine gun to destroy crew members who've been assimilated into the Borg collective. So there's fascinating things going on there, the whole question of transhumanism, because in the one hand, you could say that Star Trek, the motion picture, is also a transhumanist film, because one of the key characters at the end of the motion picture, you've got this machine, V'ger, which was the Voyager satellite, that has become self-aware, has been gathering all this knowledge, but it needs to merge with its creator. Well, it wants to merge with a human being. And at the end of the motion picture, V'ger merges with it's V'ger because some of the writing has been smudged off the off of Voyager, so it thinks it's called V'ger. It's looking for its creator. It finds humanity, and then at the end, one of the characters merges with it, and a new species is born. I mean, that's the story of the motion picture. A new species, a kind of disembodied species, as it merges with its technology, sheds its humanoid life form. And so there you could say you've got a vision of sort of transcendence of transhumanism. That's positive. Fast forward a few generations, and in First Contact, you've got a terrifying vision that's utterly rejected of transhumanism. So you actually get both a positive and negative in the Star Trek world take on transhumanism.
Wow. Well, Joe, we've only got you for a couple minutes more here, so I want to ask one last question, and it's one that we kind of deal with, and what the whole purpose of the project of Reforming Nerdom is to reclaim nerddom, to encourage Christians that there are appropriate ways of engaging with these things with our time. So what would you say to somebody who were to say to you, why is it worth a Christian's time to engage with Star Trek from a time perspective, from a content perspective? What do you think? What would you say to that person who is potentially pietistic?
What's the elevator
and thinks,
pitch?
Yeah, why would it be of value, of a worthwhile endeavor to engage with Star Trek?
Well, watching anything is a pastime. And I would say the vast majority of people who would say, well, Star Trek's a waste of time are watching other things. So, part of my leisure time is to watch things that I'm interested in. And this has been one of them. Some people choose to play golf. Some would say that, adults hitting little balls into holes is a waste of time. And is a good walk spoiled, a game of golf. But, I play a bit of golf too. So, at the end of the day, I think that there are, as a pastime, if you're going to watch something, there are a lot worse things that could be watched than Star Trek for some of the reasons that I've suggested. Second of all, I think The Next Generation was, for a long time, the most popular television series in syndicated television history. I think if you look it up online, for a long time, it was the most popular, the most successful syndicated television series in history, which means a lot of people were watching it. And just as we've described in our little discussion here, the themes that it brings up, the questions that it raises, well, this is very fruitful opportunity, actually, for talking about the most important issues in life that really matter. It deals with human identity. It deals with human sexuality. It deals with the future, the past. It deals with what is man, who is God, is there a God? It deals with science and rationalism and romanticism, all the major themes, and it introduces people actually to the Greco-Roman world and its mythology. So it's I think a remarkable opportunity to talk to people about these things who might be into I've had lots of conversations over the years with people, with non-Christians who watch Star Trek, and it's an in to discuss many of these themes. And then, of course, from the worldview standpoint, I mean, I've enjoyed watching a lot of them with my son, although my daughters enjoy it, but not as much as my son, who's very interested in engineering. It gives us a lot of these worldview questions to talk about and discuss. So, it's not for everybody, and I'm certainly not saying it's a second source of divine revelation. But as something to watch, if you watch television at all, then the early I agree with Nate that The Next Generation is the high watermark of the Star Trek world. But the original series and The Next Generation, especially, and the movies, are well worth watching for the themes that they raise. And also, I might add, you don't have bad language in Star Trek. You don't have sex scenes. You don't have nudity, and you have actually the world of Star Trek is, on the whole, it's portrayed as a very wholesome world, and it's a world that's constantly grappling with moral questions and seeking to do that which is right and that which is moral. Whereas much modern contemporary television is not interested in any of that. It doesn't really have a clear sense of good and evil, and you've got filthy language, and you've got nudity and sex and so on the screen. It's very difficult to avoid in your average television show today, and the movies. So Star Trek is a world where none of that features. Now, Star Trek, the original series, a lot of the aliens are exotic. Let's put it that way. But it's not. It's not a world in which you're having to deal with. Oh, quick! I've got to turn that. Fast forward. Stop that. Because there's a younger audience. So in that respect, it's wholesome television, and it forces people to think about some of the big issues.
And I will say on in terms of the language, I must admit that one of my favorite moments in Star Trek is when Data has the personality chip in, and I think it's in the movie Discovery when they're coming down and he swears, and it's one of the funniest moments in Star Trek history.
That's the movie Generations.
Yeah,
there you go.
Yeah.
It's so funny.
Yeah, that's right.
So even when they do swear,
and everybody kind of like turns.
Everybody's
and
so shocked.
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
it's pretty good.
Well, Joe, we very much appreciate your time. This was, you know what? It's made me at least consider going back and watching The Next Generation, because I did watch that a little bit growing up, but like very little. So
you need to be
you
converted,
might got
my
me
friend.
to go and do that. Now, before we wrap up, do you have any parting words, Joe, or just even maybe let people know where they can find you?
Come over to the light side is what I say, and join us. Move away from that, the Hindu.
That's a little mixing of metaphors there.
So actually, interestingly enough, I believe that the Vulcan symbol and the sign and the live long and prosper is based on the Jewish, the Hebrew greeting, to prosper and to live. So there's actually a Hebraic root to the live long and prosper. Well, I would say, I did mention Star Trek, as you said once, and I had to get it in there somewhere in the discussion of transhumanism in the mission of God. I don't harp on about it much. We rarely touch on it, if ever, at the Ezra Institute. But I'd encourage people to think about this whole question of worldview analysis, and as they're watching, television and films, do this with your kids, with your younger children and your teenagers. What's this movie communicating? What's it saying? What's the message of the director? What's the screenwriter trying to say? What are the questions that are raised by this? And of course, some programs and some films are better for doing that than others. I think that the Star Trek world is fascinating for actually worldview exploration and looking at these big questions, and actually then bringing a Christian critique to bear on that, as we've said, generally a secular humanistic worldview that still demonstrates these sprinklings, these remnants, considerable remnants actually, of a biblical world and life view.
Mm-hmm. No, very cool. Well, listeners, we hope that this was informative. It was for me. It was enjoyable. Joe, just want to thank you again for joining us. It was great to be able to have you on here. The next time we will have you on here, maybe it'll be an exclusive show for our patrons where you and Nate nerd out about why am I drawing a blank on it?
Dumb and Dumber.
The one Dumb and Dumber. Thank you. Wow. Thank you. We'll get you guys nerding out about Dumb and Dumber, because I was privy to that conversation, and it was one of the funniest things I've heard. So for maybe our patrons at some point, we'll have you on for that. But again, listeners, thank you for joining us. And you can always, as always, you can find us on YouTube, podcast services, and if you want to participate in what will be a Star Wars versus Star Trek debate on our Discord channel, you can join us over at Patreon. But until then, stay nerdy.